I'm going to now pass the mic or pass the torch to Dr. Ellen Ray Cachola, who will be presenting on William Richardson, and her title of her presentation is Engaging Statehood and the American Legal System to Create Opportunities for Homegrown Hawaiian Leadership. The questions that you have in the chat, though, we will address it after her presentation. So keep adding questions to the chat, and then we'll answer them as we after Ellen's presentation. Thank you. So Ellen, you're up.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much to Dorian and Laurie for a wonderful contemporary presentation about the different debates that we are facing in the islands. My presentation is more of a historical one about a particular person, but I will try to address the issues of debate and diplomacy as I go through it. And so I'm the evening supervisor and archives manager at the University of Hawaii School of Law Library. Thank you, Hawaii Council for the Humanities, and Shannon, Cristobal, for inviting me to share a little bit about an archival collection that we are proud to take care of. It is of William S. Richardson, which Laurie had mentioned earlier. So I'm going to talk about how he engaged with statehood and American legal systems to create opportunities for homegrown leaders in Hawaii. To begin, I want us to think about what is a diplomat. There are two definitions that I want us to hold on to as we go through this presentation. One definition is that they are an official representing a country abroad, or they can be a person who can deal with people in a sensitive and effective way. So being a diplomat also means being able to navigate debates and to advocate for a way forward, especially for our place in Hawaii. So there are many debates here in Hawaii, and there are many Hawaiian scholars and leaders who debate about Hawaii's political status and how we should relate to the United States. And currently we are the 50th state of Hawaii. And one memorable leader was the late Native Hawaiian kumu, Haunani Trask, who was a professor at the Center for Hawaiian Studies at UH Manoa. She's famous for her quote, "We are not American. We'll die as Hawaiians. We will never be American," which she stated among the lahui for the Hawaiian nationals at Iolani Palace on January 17, 1993. Kumu Trask was speaking from an anti-colonial position that resists U.S. colonization of Hawaii since the illegal overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom in 1893, the illegal annexation in 1898, and statehood in 1959. She believes that the U.S. is colonizing Hawaii and dispossessing Native Hawaiians from their rights to their homeland. This is Kehaulani Kauanui, who's a Native Hawaiian professor at Wesleyan University, and she elaborated on Kumu Trask's criticism of the U.S. presence in Hawaii because there was no treaty of annexation. Contemporary movements for federal recognition of the Hawaiian nation by the United States would extinguish Hawaiian independence that has already been recognized internationally and would lead to more American takeover of lands and marginalization of Hawaiian rights. She wrote, "It would seem that Hawaiians might have a better chance at de facto self-determination by remaining under the current state situation, while pressing forward on international claims and resisting any U.S. federal recognition that would foreclose our legitimate claims to independence." This is Dean Saranillo, a local Maui scholar of Japanese and Filipino descent, now a professor at NYU, and an author of a book called Unsustainable Empire, which she wrote, "Hawaii's admission as a U.S. state played a key role in expanding empire. The Cold War liberal multiculturalism that Hawaii became an example of allowed for such acts of imperialism to be recoded in the language of decolonization. U.S. statehood occurred in Hawaii not because of stability, but because of numerous rounds of economic depression strung together through a fell-forward logic that viewed incorporation as a resolution to economic crisis or expansion." And then lastly, we have Noelani Arista, who's a Native Hawaiian professor and the author of the book, The Kingdom and the Republic. And she states, "Concentrating on negotiations and deliberations at the confluence of worlds of words, rather than always emphasizing conflict and clashing, helps us to see Hawaiian governing practices and transformations in Hawaiian law in context." So now we turn to William S. Richardson, who this presentation is about. He was the Lieutenant Governor of Hawaii during the early years of statehood, and he became the 16th Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Hawaii. So in an interview with Leslie Wilcox, during the last years of his life, he said, We have to use the American and Hawaiian system, and we must find a solution. So we are not coming up against each other. We have to try to resolve them in a modern way. I don't mean we should reject old or new ways, but that is for this court and wise people to decide. Oh, I don't think we can go back to being a separate Hawaiian nation. I want to take the good parts. I want to go back to the old way. I can't go back to the old way. We are a different nation today. So as you can see, there is a debate among many Hawaiian thinkers and leaders about the political status of Hawaii. So let's learn more about Richardson and why he thought the way that he did. So the context of William S. Richardson. He was born in 1919 to a mixed heritage Native Hawaiian, Chinese, and Caucasian family, and he grew up in a plantation community in Kaimuki during the Territory era in a working class family that used secondhand materials to build their home and to make clothes. He might have witnessed the workers striking against the plantation owners during the 1930s and the 40s. He attended UH Manoa for his BA and Cincinnati University for his JD, which is a law degree. He was drafted into the US military after law school and became a platoon leader for the 1st Filipino Infantry in New Guinea and in the Philippines. After the war, he returned to Hawaii, married Amy Ching, and got involved in politics. Richardson and the Hawaii Democratic Party. Building on the networks he built as a student at UH Manoa, he got involved in the Democratic Party and became the chairman. He was part of a civil rights movement led by descendants of plantation workers entering into Hawaii politics after it had been controlled by the plantation oligarchy during the Territory era. Some joke with Richardson saying he was a token Hawaiian in politics, but he said it might have been so, but there were other Hawaiians in leadership too at that time. Richardson won a successful campaign and became lieutenant governor under Governor John A. Burns in 1962. He built his campaign bridging Japanese, Hawaiian, and other multi-ethnic communities. Richardson embraced the vision of Hawaii's admission into the United States as a 50th state, and this differed from other Hawaiian leaders who thought Hawaii admission to the 50th state was moving away from Hawaiian sovereignty. At the same time, the state was also transitioning from agricultural plantation to tourism economy, causing upheaval in jobs, and some former plantation workers and their families fell through the cracks, leading to poverty and later evictions. Richardson stated in an interview with Leslie Wilcox, "Well, to me, admission into the United States was a great cause of celebration. We are part of a great country. Like every state in the Union, they had to live and have new laws jive with the old. Even when you go back to England and the common law came over across the country to Louisiana Purchase and where the French came in, the country had to adjust to that. Now we have to see how it affects Asia and the Pacific Ocean." Here, Richardson accepts the process of the spread of European and American rule across the North America territory and into the Pacific, which tracks Ka'aunui and Saranilio resist. Richardson, as the 16th Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. As a judge, he said, judges must live in the past, but not only in the past. He must adopt the fundamental principles of the past and bring them into focus with the present. And in Hawaii, the present, like the past, is a time of migration. Richardson's court was known as an activist court. Richardson drew from his experience as a boy being frustrated when he couldn't access parts of the beach because it was cut off by hotel property. And he knew that after the illegal overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom and through the Territory period, the courts were deciding more on a Western orientation, a perspective that wasn't a comfortable fit with Hawaii's indigenous people and immigrant peoples. So as a judge, he believed that Hawaii had a unique legal system, a system of laws that was originally built on ancient and traditional culture that was displaced, but he knew that he could draw upon the guiding principles that continue to remain. So here we see that Richardson is developing a criticism of American legal influence in Hawaii's law during the Territory period. He may have come to this awareness having grown up in the Territory era and saw the injustices experienced by working class Hawaiians and immigrants. Or he might have been influenced by the Hawaiian Renaissance movement that was emerging during the 60s and the 70s. Richardson's court, after statehood, returned an interpretation of the law to those with deep roots in and profound love for Hawaii. There was a conscious effort to look to Hawaiian custom and tradition in deciding their cases, and in consistence with Hawaiian practice. So Richardson established the public trust doctrine in Hawaii, which is what Lori was talking about regarding the fishing rights and the beach access. So drawing from Hawaiian kingdom law, Richard's courts reasoned that it was the state, the successor to the kings of old, that owned all water flowing in natural water courses. Therefore, the modern state of Hawaii should now hold the resource in trust for the people. This became known as the public trust doctrine, or that certain crucial natural resources are shared common property of all citizens and cannot be subject to private ownership, must be preserved and protected by the government. So resources like water should be managed by the government, so regular folks like the taro and the rice patch owners could have access and not just the corporations. Coastline up to the vegetation line is public property managed by the state so that common folks can use the beach like a park or for cultural practices. As well as new land created by lava flows became part of the state of Hawaii, not an extension of an adjacent private property. So Richardson stated that his mission as Chief Justice was to bring the old Hawaiian way to merge with the American and common law system of the past. So another interesting thing that happened in Richardson's life was his appointment as a Bishop Estate trustee, and people considered it was critical of it. And so after retiring from his position in the Supreme Court, people criticized his appointment to the Bishop Estates because why was it that the Supreme Court could assign a former Chief Justice into this trustee position? Because some people thought of it as a conflict of interest. Richardson also was already past the age of 70, which was assumed to be the cutoff point for state workers. But because the Bishop Estate was a private entity, they could decide their own trustee eligibility status. Nevertheless, Richardson was able to get the position because of his experience as Chief Justice, and because of the work that he did in that position, he was able to deal with the financial and management complexities of Kamehameha schools and the Bishop Estate. So the last thing that Richardson did before he died in 2010 was advocate for the Hawaii State Legislature to pay for the development of a law school in Hawaii. So this was a great opportunity for people of modest means in Hawaii to advance socially. Law school in general was expensive because it was on the continental US and out of reach for working class Hawaiians and immigrant populations. If there were no locally trained attorneys, the legal and government officials of Hawaii would be from the continental US and not necessarily know the local history and customs of the islands. So this is why Richardson was very focused on trying to make a law school in Hawaii. And he was successful. In 1973, our law school was opened, and in 82, the law school was named the William S. Richardson School of Law. And so there's a model that the law school is very proud of and likes to remember, and it's King Kamehameha's Law of the Splintered Paddle, which says, let the old men and old women and the children go and sleep by the wayside. Let them not be molested. And this model shapes the curriculum, which is to advocate for the vulnerable in society. The William S. Richardson School of Law trains students in basics of American law, but also offers specialties like Native Hawaiian law, environmental law, Pacific Asian law, elder law, international law, business law, among other programs. Hawaii leaders that graduated from Richardson Law include Governor John Waihee, Judge Sabrina McKenna, Representative Colleen Hanabusa, Senator Brian Taniguchi, Judge Artemio Baxa, Lieutenant Governor James Iona, and Mayor Kirk Caldwell. So in conclusion, what do you think? Was Richardson a diplomat? What is the historical, economic, and cultural context that Richardson grew up in as a youth? Did this background influence the way he was diplomatic to the diverse ethnic groups in Hawaii and in the Democratic Party? How did Richardson serve as a diplomat for Native Hawaiian law, culture, and rights within the American legal system during his position as Chief Justice of the Hawaii Supreme Court? How would you describe Richardson's leadership style since Hawaii's admission into statehood? Does his leadership style emulate a diplomat? And going back to the beginning of my presentation about the debate among Hawaiian scholars and leaders about the political status of Hawaii, do you think William S. Richardson contributed to Hawaiian sovereignty, extended U.S. colonization of Hawaii, or created another way for the people of Hawaii to determine their future? So that's it. If you're interested in learning more about Richardson's archive as well as the history of our law school, please contact me at ellen@hawaii.edu, or you can call me 956-2167. We do have an archives website as shown here. Richardson's Finding Aid is currently not up public yet because we're building that collection. But you can still contact me directly, and if you or your students want to have specific information, I can digitize it and email it to you or your student. It will be no problem. So thank you all for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ellen, for that wonderful presentation. Wow, I learned so much.